Hello.
This amazing thing. And yeah, okay, so we're gonna get started. But I think that if that's what works for you, you should go for it, definitely.
Yeah.
I just want to say hi to Luzuko and Moseni. How are you guys doing?
Well, not bad, not bad.
Good.
Great, sharp.
Right, just give me 1 second. I just want to close my curtains. Right, so I think Gavin will probably give 5 minutes then, right?
Yes, I think so. Seems a few people are jumping on now. I'd imagine there'll be a few more in the next few minutes.
Nice. So actually, mostly everyone that's here was from the previous session as well, which is great to see. Hey, Savira, how are you?
Hi, Tabiso. I'm great, thanks. And you?
Good. I saw that you joined the Telegram group.
I have, finally. Yeah, it's good to see so many updates about stuff I had no idea about, like this slate and that slate. Just amazed. Yeah. I hate to think what I've been missing. Anyway, better late than never.
No, I mean, it's look, sometimes, I mean, I always speak about this. It's there's quite a bit of disconnection that we have as writers in general. Throw on a pandemic and lack of communication as well, then it really goes and it really magnifies the isolation we have. So being part of a Telegram group, even if you don't check every message all the time, just helps us communicate with each other. Hey, there are opportunities, or hey, we're still here. Don't give up.
Yeah, it's really great.
Awesome. I'm seeing some more people come through. Lauren, Khalid, how you guys doing?
Hi, good, thanks. And you?
Good.
And I'll say, hey, Lauren, nice to see you again.
Yes, hi, Gavin. How are you?
Hello.
Hey, Khalid, how you doing?
Hey, what's up?
Good. So look, we're going to be waiting 2.5 more minutes. Just waiting for more people to join on. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are going to join on. But look, basically in a nutshell, I'm going to just go through how we do this again. It's going to be the first 40 to 45 minutes is Gavin and I are going to unpack the theme, the topic of the day. Particularly today's structure. One of many talks I hope we will be having on structure, but there are many parts of it that we'd like to talk about, but I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of how I tell stories with structure. Gavin's going to focus on something as well that's very particular to how he wants to present the topic. And then hopefully everyone's got questions about that or anything else writing related. What happens is that the 40 minutes after that, the 40 to 45 minutes afterwards is question answer session. And really come with it with every single thing that you can think of that's related to storytelling, writing, or even the more esoteric, what it is to be a writer, what it is to be a storyteller. Recently, I came across a topic on the South African, was it the Essay History website, which is, of course, an official government website. And they were talking about South African film, and it was, I'm not going to say very, very badly looking at South African writing, but it wasn't favorably looking at South African writing. So something like that, if you feel that there is something we're trying to answer and we're not getting to it as South African writers, definitely bring up the conversation. This is the platform to do that. So we've got about a minute more to go. We'll wait for it, but as long as everyone is feeling up for the conversation, I would definitely love to hear what everyone has in the second part of this webinar. Gavin, would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, just that structure is obviously a massive topic, and we certainly won't to get it as a complete. Now you've got structure forever or after in one discussion. We hope there'll be many more. It's one of those important fundamentals that even throughout your career, you're going to keep examining and keep seeing anew. So there probably will be many. And really, I think the best we can do in 45 minutes is just to raise a few points for discussion and consideration. And then we do hope in the question and answers that you'll point us to, areas that are of particular interest or And otherwise, as Teresa was saying, that, you know, that is the time where it's not just about the topic, it's about you guys, and anything you feel like asking, you know, this is where we make ourselves available so that anything can be asked and explored.
Okay, great. I think we actually should start now. It's 5 past. I'm pretty sure people will be filtering in. Generally, that's how it works. But one thing that I want to bring up is, yes, we have been covering several topics before, things like character, you know, basically talking about scene, as well as enjoying more and more conversations about how we deal with story. But I think that one of the things that's probably the most important is how you tell that story. You may have an idea of what you want to say and what you feel the character should be doing and so forth, but how you tell this story dictates a large part of, first of all, your enjoyment, but also the enjoyment of the viewer. And how that story plays out also informs pretty much what the film is going to be showing for the greater world. And, you know, as time goes by, where it stands in this cinematic landscape or this TV landscape. So I'm going to just quickly introduce the idea, which is structure, and most importantly, the way in which it resembles life. So Gavin, would you like to say something before I jump into what I want to talk about with regards to that?
No, go for it.
Okay, great. So basically, you know, there are many books about structure. I mean, we can count the number of books written by theorists on, you know, many hands as to what screenplays look like, how stories, you know, supposed to tell the story and so forth. What it does come down to really is something that's been tried and tested as time has gone by. Structure informs the tension, the drama, the basic question of why we're watching the film, why we're engaging with the story. So when it comes down to how that story has been told, whether you tackle it from a 2-act structure or a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure, even a 1-act structure, how that story gets told is really, really down to what you're trying to say. So generally, whenever I look at story, I sort of look at it from the point of view of Aristotle, as well as Paul Schrader. And Paul Schrader, of course, the very famous filmmaker behind Taxi Driver, or rather the writer behind Taxi Driver and collaborator with Martin Scorsese. He looks at structure as something that is a balance between metaphor and theme. So everyone's heard about theme before. It's basically the central part of your story, you know, the why. If your theme is about family, what about family, et cetera, et cetera. But really the way Paul takes it and how I take it really is structure is combined from metaphor being the keyhole in which theme is expressed. So what does that mean? So I'm going to use one of my films as an example. It's called Prime. I have spoken about it before when we were talking about Scene. I'm just going to bring it up over here. I'm wondering if everyone can see it. Okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can. Great. So with regards to structure, long before I think about, is it a 3-act structure or is it a 5-act structure, yada, 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 I start to think about, okay, what is it I'm trying to explore? What is this obsession that I have? So for this story, I had the idea that pride and self-obsession can lead to the downfall of great men. And great in inverted commas, because really no man who believes himself to be great can be trusted as being great. So the idea that many men who maybe narcissistically view themselves as, you know, big men or great men, this is something that we usually see as flirting with disaster if that narcissism grows too large for, you know, their reach. So in this particular case, I had this idea that if a guy who is obsessed with being great, too obsessed, if he is possessed, and that's the metaphor, if he is possessed, would he know if he's possessed or not? Would he in some way actually explain away his position as being something that is coincidence or something that is happening outside of himself? Because great men tend to believe whenever problems are around them that it's other people causing this problem. When I say great men, I use inverted commas. Really great men don't believe that. They're always trying to address problems around them. But people who believe that the world is causing them problems tend to explain things away from themselves. So possession would be something that would be very weird to them, but it would be explainable. Oh, that thing that happened, oh, I must have just fallen asleep. or that thing that happened, shit, it was that guy who crashed into me, not the other way around. Now, from that idea, I think about the structure. And when I say the structure, I don't mean, what happens, inciting incidents, etc., etc. I'm talking about, what about this character is something they dread, they fear, and is probably the worst thing that could happen to you. So in this story, I have a proud, progressive, but obsessive man, Marius, who's afraid of becoming his father. And he's rather afraid of becoming the failure that was his father, a racist, abusive, and general all-around piece of shit man. Sorry for using the right word, the wrong word at least. But the idea is that he sees his father as being someone who never adapted to modern South Africa, was trapped in the, not the luxuries, but the opportunities afforded to him by apartheid South Africa. And when that stuff was taken away, could never adapt to what was needed of him to succeed and thrive. So he is so afraid of anything that resembles his father that he will fight obsessively to not become his father. So what happens is in the beginning of the story is, what would this story look like if that man disappears? If that father is gone from the picture and he is only left with the memory and the pain of losing this villain of his life. So keeping those things in mind, I know that in my story, I need to be tackling this fear the whole time. I need to be doing things rather as a storyteller. Maybe the story tells itself in this way, but this story should be constantly prodding, constantly poking at this fear. And whether or not it's something he resolves is where the structure of the story comes from. Because it could be a case that in this story, in coming up against this fear of his father, or fear of this boogeyman of the father that he is lost, he might resolve it, might become better than his father, and then in fact master his own destiny. Now that looks as if, three distinct phases of his life are occurring. He experiences something, he faces up against it, and masters it to solve a big problem, right? So you understand that three major moments in this guy's life should happen. But what if he doesn't? What if he denies that journey of becoming a better person, of becoming someone who doesn't only place himself at the forefront of his own journey, of his own story? What if it's a case that he ignores the signs that something is wrong and keeps pushing back on change until he is forced to at the last second to finally change? What would happen in that story? What would it look like? A bunch of him denying his problems until the moment he's finally forced to confronting his problems. That doesn't look like a 3-act structure. It looks as if something big is happening and then something small happens right at the end. And if I want to, as a storyteller, leave the story on that note, just him finally confronting his problem, and that's the end of the story, then I can't tell a 5-act structure to this thing. I can't tell a 3-act structure. Very clearly, here's someone who's ignoring their problems, and here's someone who's finally forced to confront their problems. End of story. So I look at structure in that way. I look at what the metaphor is, I look at what I'm trying to say, the dramatic argument, the central theme, and then I see what best plays out that story. What do I personally like? Is it a story that's a tragedy, or is it a story that's a comedy, or is it a straight up drama? So keeping those things in mind, I will look at the story, look at the challenges, do a little outline of things that can possibly happen. And then at the end of that outline, if I have come up with the solution, if I have said, okay, this is exactly what I think should happen, then I start writing. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I leave it up to the process of writing the story. But in doing so, I'm not looking at a formula. I am not looking at a calculation of how to tell the story. I am trying to address what this character needs. Now, the biggest problem that we will have in telling stories in South Africa is that we don't necessarily deal with our stories all the time. We tend to copy American stories and bring them over here, or European stories, and use those as the way in which we tell our stories. I don't know if you guys have been watching the Netflix originals, but a lot of those stories, sometimes they don't look like South African stories because the structure doesn't suit them. South African stories are very much ones driven by violence. Violence being either physical violence, emotional violence, or the violence of people not talking to each other and not understanding each other. So a lot of our stories tend to not reflect that. And as a result, we have a disassociation between our audience and the stories we think we're telling for our audiences. And that's a big idea to wrap your mind around. I know it's like a nuclear bomb of an idea, but the idea that I'm presenting is that because our stories are not the kinds of stories you'll see in North America, for example, which is a very rich land with very much first world problems, I challenge myself to think, what's the kind of person I have over here? What's the kind of character that I have over here? What kind of thing am I trying to say through this person? So coming back to Prime, which is this film, I thought that, okay, if this is someone who is trying to be anti-racist or an anti-abusive person, he's going to reflect every part of his life as being opposed to his father, being opposed to his white racist father. He's going to be dating a young black girl. He's going to be fighting for equality in his workplace, etc., etc. But what if that's all part of the ruse of this guy? You know, what if this is something that actually deep down inside he doesn't care about, he actually opposes? So now you have the conflict between who he wants to be versus who he really is. Maybe he is more like his father than he thinks, and he's deathly afraid of that. So now where does possession come in? Where does this metaphor? Here's someone who you can imagine is very complicated and is messing up his own life. There's complications. He's obsessed with control, and he doesn't want to be in a situation where he doesn't have control of his life. He's also addicted to pornography. He's addicted to the idea of sex. Not going to say he's a sex addict, but he's definitely addicted to the idea of having power and control over sex. So what happens is that possession comes through that form. The thing that comes to possess him, this demon that needs to enter his life, comes through his addiction of porn, and then comes through him having chance encounters with someone he finds very attractive, but someone who he's not going to say, why is this person coming to me? Why is this person talking to me? Why am I in a situation where someone's suddenly unveiling themselves to me? Why? Because he thinks that, no, I'm obviously a charming man. I'm obviously someone who's gifted with power over women or whatever. So he doesn't question it. And because he doesn't question himself in this role, he starts to fall into this trap. And that trap is designed by this demon to destabilize him from his girlfriend, who is actually the only rock he has in his life. So I'm not gonna continue the rest of the story, but the whole idea is this possession, this plot, if you want to call it that, is designed to tackle him and to throw him against the wall and shake him down until he has nothing left other than the problem he has in his life. And that is to stop living narcissistically, but to actually live for more than just himself. And in doing so, become greater than his father. So in this particular story, it ends in a sort of a 2-act structure. He refuses to do things until he's finally forced to confront that he may be actually be possessed and he needs to save a life for someone other than himself. And he's come to a situation where now he has to choose. Either he saves himself, dooming another person, or he sacrifices himself, saving the love of his life. So that's a 2-act structure. And I can't apply a 5-act structure to it because nothing about a 5-act or 3-act structure. There's no hero's journey over here. It is a tragedy of a guy finally realizing he's not in control of his life and now needs to make a decision about saving another person. So generally, that's how I view structure. Now, you got many books out there, Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, you got Story by Robert McKee. You even have books about Shakespeare's 5-act structure going into depth as to how Macbeth and Hamlet and so forth are, defined by these graphs and so forth. But at the basic fundamental question you should be asking yourselves in terms of story is, am I saying something? And what do I choose to be the vehicle of that? What do I choose to be the struggle for my main character to go up against? And how do I tell the story through that? Do I want the person to have resolution? Do I want the person to solve all the problems in their lives? Or do I want that person to completely fail? Do they want that person to have an absolute tragedy and the tragedy itself is the story? And no, from there, you should be able to figure out, okay, maybe there's an inciting incident here or there, or maybe he comes up against this and he realizes this, or he or she or anything like that. But the point of it is, it's not from a story formula that you get this. It's from you being honest about your intention, about the story you want to tell. Okay, Gavin, sorry. I'm going to hand it over back to you. And I want you to, if you think that there's something that I've said that's misspoken, or if there's something that you want to add to, please let me know.
Cool. Will you stop the screen sharing
Sure.
shot? Okay, so I don't want to speak too closely to what you've said, but I'll certainly build on it. So in a sense, again, this is a huge topic, and we could talk about this in so many ways for so long. The best we can do really is just to do a short, shallow dive and hopefully raise some interesting points for consideration. So structure is one of those massive areas that a writer just has to kind of master and understand for themselves. And structure and theme are just intimately tied together, because the theme really is the governing principle of the structure. And theme is basically a moral principle. How does one person grow from one state to another? What's needed to move up the arc of your own evolution? And the structure will always follow the theme. So before I get into that, I just wanted to digress, because where does structure really come from? Because there are all these books and there are all these thoughts and opinions, and I'm sure we've all read some of them. And the truth is, when you sit down, you want to tell your story, it's not necessarily very helpful to go, okay, I need an inciting incident, I need this, and the second act turning point should be here, and blah blah blah. It's not an intuitive way to work. When you think of a story, you think of a story, and you think of a character, and you think of some incidents, and then knowing this kind of 3-act blueprint doesn't necessarily help you tell your story, and often can be counterproductive. But the truth is that story is all hardwired into us. We as human beings think in story structure. We think in story terms. Someone comes to you and they tell you a story about what happened, and you feel like intuitively this doesn't quite make sense. Often it's because there'll be more of a story, like there will be more to the story, and things that you are hearing that don't make sense because you understand story intuitively. If somebody's story doesn't kind of, something scratchy, then okay, they're probably lying, or maybe something else happened, or you'll kind of fill in some of the gaps because you kind of know how stories work, and how the world works. And if someone comes and they said, oh, I just won $100 million in the lottery, and can you please lend me like $10 to go and cash in my ticket, and I'll buy you something? You're generally like, okay, well, already this is something weird. He tells you, I just won the $100 million lottery, but I really don't actually have money for food. Can you give me $10? You'll be even more, okay, this dude's lying, because I understand that if you have X amount of money that you've just won, then you should be able to pay for your own food. There's just a logic here where somebody's story, if it doesn't match up to reality, then it falls apart. There's holes, and immediately we get suspicious. So on one sense, story is just about logic. Like, does one event lead to another event? Does the thing that you depict reach the conclusion, in the steps that you're shown, or is there something missing? Or is there something extra that's needed? Or is what's there not just not going to lead where you send the person? So we all know, we've seen films where it's happily ever after, but you like looked at the story and you're like, well, how on earth is it happily ever after? Like, given everything I've seen, this conclusion just doesn't follow, because intuitively and instinctively we understand story. Sometimes it's a bit harder when you're trying to construct your own story, but story is basically like the framework through which we understand and interpret facts. So, you take two people who have like basically a different fundamental story about reality. And for me, the two biggest like kind of gaps is, say you take like someone who's totally a materialist, doesn't believe in anything spiritual, and then you take someone who's very spiritual and believes that there's a spiritual aspect to reality. And those two people can witness the same events, and they're going to concoct a whole different interpretation of the meaning and the thing. One person will see a sunset and say, that's the hand of God. Another person will see the sunset and they'll go, oh, okay, well, that's just light hitting the thing, and so on and so forth. Because it's not the facts about the sunset or what they witnessed that's different. It's their story through which they're understanding the world that's different. And so they have a different experience, even though the facts they could probably agree on quite happily. So when we get to story structure, what we're really looking at is, how do our brains actually weave together a story? And what's at the heart of it? How does it do the weaving? And every story is fundamentally about somebody who is challenged to grow and does, which is the comedic genre, or doesn't, the tragedy. The person is challenged to grow and fails to do so and then suffers death or symbolic death as a result. And this is fundamentally a blueprint to how humans live our lives. You know, we are always confronted with the potential for growth, which we either meet or fail to meet. And that's just happening every day in so many ways, you know, whether it's growing in your relationship, growing in relationship to your job, growing in relationship to your spirit or whatever. There's hundreds of ways that we can be growing or fail to grow, or, you know, every day throughout our lives. And the reason we're consumed with stories is because it shows us how that works. So that theme, that thing of what's this film about, you know, is a question of who's being asked to grow how. And then we will see how their relationship to that challenge unfolds, either successfully or unsuccessfully. So whatever we just need like a moral premise or theme. You know, that's something very few writers, it's actually almost, when I look at writers, it's almost the last thing that clicks into place is how to really work with theme. How to understand the whole journey as an expression of a moral premise. And because you can get like a 3-act structure that works on a plot level. You know, it's just this event, you know, the guy got a gun, went and he, you know, saved the princess and ever after. And then, you know, it's fine and it works on a surface level. But if it doesn't have that subjective layer of the character and how that character grows to do that, then it's a very emotionally unsatisfying story. And structure always has to work on 2 levels. It works on the internal level as the character grows and changes, and it works on the exterior level as that character grows in relationship to the events that unfold in the story. So that understanding of how the events of our lives affect us and how we respond and then impact the world around us is the fundamental understanding that will dictate how you work with structure. Because that is the pattern and the blueprint of story. And knowing that will help you also potentially create interesting stories, because we all know some of the obvious stories because they're the things that we all kind of go through. Like a lot of the, you know, the basic genres that we see all the time, like to come up with, okay, say romantic comedy. You know, 2 people want to get together. What's going to be required? Something will to keep them apart. The obstacle is always like the key thing in the romantic comedy, but it's fundamentally, you know, what brings 2 people together and how does that work? And you know, if in a romantic comedy, for me, it's like one of the examples of the truly corrupt story genres, because romantic comedies have almost nothing to do with actual relationship and the work that's required in relationship, which is always growth. Normally what keeps people apart is that one person has some shadow that they cannot, you know, get past, and the other person is sick of. But in sort of American romantic comedies, it's generally, oh, well, you know, some external interference, like, oh, you know, the other romantic interest is, you know, lying and there's some confusion or something. Anyway, let me go back. So if one has a particular example, I'll give you a particular example. You're going to need a theme that describes an area of growth. So say something to this, it takes courage to speak your truth. Just that. So one, you're denoting that as a virtue, it's a virtue to speak your truth, but you're also saying what the character needs if they're going to attain this virtue. And it's courage, because sometimes it's really hard to, you know, say who you are, what you're about in certain instances. So you'll always start at a place where the character's in the negative in relationship to that theme. So something will be off. So like Tabisa's story is, you know, a guy who's maybe not aware that he's like his father. He doesn't know. He's playing out patterns in response to old patterns, and he doesn't realize that he's in the flaw. So in my example, it'll be someone maybe who's scared to speak their truth. They're a people pleaser, say. And maybe their truth contradicts the people around them. And then they know that if they're going to speak it, they're going to get ostracized and people are going to be pissed off. But something's going to come along in that first act to challenge them to jump into a new way of being. And that'll do that. And that's kind of first act crossing to second act. Now they're in the place where they're in a different place and they're getting to be someone different, but they have to make it their own. And the way human beings grow essentially is that there's a process between who you were and who you become. And it's a process of basically dying to who you were, often dying through suffering and struggle. So the exterior events of the film in the basic second act is going to challenge you to get to that breaking point of releasing who you were, that person maybe who didn't have the courage to speak the truth. And they will pile, all the things that go wrong, like if you didn't speak your truth to your lover, and then they realize suddenly you're not the person that they thought they were, and the whole relationship goes into the toilet because suddenly it'll come upon them unexpectedly because you never said. And then maybe you have to do the work, blah, blah, blah. And then, you reach a point where you make a choice to become someone new, and then you reapply, and suddenly you start speaking your truth. And then you see how the world changes because you've changed. And that's the third act. If you are changed, or if in Tobias's case, if it's a tragedy, it'll be the same because I didn't change. So then it's just something comes to essentially kill you. And that's kind of how structure works. You can break it up into 5 acts. You can take the inciting incident and put it like at the end, or do flashbacks instead. And you can do all sorts of things in terms of that linear structure. And so long as it makes sense and the audience can watch that journey and understand that this person started there and went there, then you have a story that can work, even if it doesn't go linearly from the person started there to go there. And lots of non-traditional structures are basically just playing with the pieces. But really at the heart, it's always about how does one person grow from being one person to being a new person, and how does the world take them through their process, and how does that world respond when they were at a place that is less than they are at the end, and then how does it respond when they change. And that's story, and that's life, and that's we can't really get away from it, no matter how much we play with the pieces. And I'll just, by way of conclusion, I'll just mention one other point, because that thing of the moral premise, here's a virtue that'll make a story, the courage to speak your truth. You can make a story about that. But ultimately, when I go back and I look at, say, Aristotle, we all know the Poetics, or many of us know the Poetics as one of these basic texts that everyone looks at in storytelling as one of the essentials. And in that text, Aristotle talks about the basic dialectic, which is this thing of we're in a world of duality. There is opposites, whether it's male and female, which is active and receptive, or whether it's, night and day, cold and heat, there's all these opposites. And there's a dialectic in how we behave. So, if you can't speak your truth, then it's going to have certain effects. Change that'll have different effects, because it's always like, magnets are bumping against each other. There's always opposites, and action and interaction, action, interaction. That's kind of how it works. But in the ethics, Aristotle will tell you that the virtues are one. There is only one virtue. And if you've got one, you've got all of them. And if you lack one, you lack all of them. And it's a basic, different way of looking at ethics. Because essentially what we're trying to do is express ourselves. We're really trying to express our soul, our spirit. Really, it's about how spirit grows. That's what story is and how structure works. And it's saying that, there's a relationship between that spirit and the outer world. That's what is that interaction, and it's causing that. So you change yourself, you change the world. It's just that simple, because it's not two different things. So that thing of everything being one is about finding that balance in you. It's about harmony. So, if somebody, so you tell that story about someone who is gaining the courage to speak their truth. Now, they can miss that mark, that place of harmony between the opposites in 2 ways. They can do too little. They can just be scared to speak their truth. And then they can miss it by doing too much. It's like the masculine form of missing, because you can tell your truth in the wrong way, at the wrong time, to the wrong person. There's so many ways that suddenly, oh no, now I have to speak my truth, can become like really dangerous and destructive in your life, where you don't have the empathy to understand when and how to speak your truth. And it can be just as bad as not speaking your truth. So you really are examining like the balance in a person and how they relate to the world. And because stories are short, That's where we try and get to a very particular place and a way of seeing it. But really, we're talking about the balance that exists in the person and how they act. And your understanding of that will always translate. It's basically, it's your own perspective that you're always expressing. And so, sorry, again, I'm trying to call it like actually something that should probably be a day lecture into, a nutshell. But to put that into context, the person who doesn't have the courage to speak their truth in front of people probably also wouldn't, have the courage to disobey people when there's something that's, really right in front of them, and they know it's right, but everyone else is going wrong. Because I think speaking of truth is the same kind of thing, and so they would lack the courage then to maybe stand up to other people, or maybe etc. As the same character expresses itself in situations. The same realm of flaw would just have many different expressions in other ways. They might not have the courage to be truthful in other ways, in their relationship or in many other things. So when it comes to structure, really for me, the key is to look at, as Tobias also saying, what's the character, what's their flaw, and how do they move from that place where they've got this flaw to a place of either having outgrown it or being punished. And it really is that simple, but it is the defining action, because every scene should basically reflect that scene. In every scene, you should see that person in relationship to them trying to speak their truth to people, and it'll be in different situations and different things. And every time they'll have to make that choice, or they'll be facing the consequences of an earlier choice. But scenes do work that way, so that theme should be present in every single scene, because it's always the character expressing themselves. And until they change that flaw, they will have the same results. And then when they do, in the third act, and they do something different, they'll have different results. And that's kind of story, and that's kind of life.
Thanks, Kevin. Look, I actually wanted to, I'm thinking about it the whole time, as you've been talking about it. I think there's a film that actually really speaks to what we're describing over here in terms of structure being a reflection of the reality of that character, the real world that's there versus what they want, versus them changing or not changing, and that affecting them directly towards the end of the film, especially. So I think of, for example, Parasite. And I'm sorry if anyone who is listening hasn't seen Parasite before, but I'm not going to really spoil it that much, I hope. So Parasite is basically, the premise of Parasite is that poverty never really lets you go. You may escape it, but it will always grab and pull you back. So in this particular case, we have a family, a poor family, that's trying to escape poverty by conning a rich family into taking them into their realm, their space. But what happens is that both through natural disaster and through their own flaws, this family starts to reject, this rich family starts to reject the poor family. And what happens is they not only reject this family, but ultimately this poor family never changes their habits, never changes the way that they perceive the world, that they are, the ones that need to defeat the world. They need to defeat these overwhelming odds to survive. And as a result, because they don't change, there is an ultimate tragedy that happens at the end of the film. So what Bong Joon-ho is trying to do with the structure of the film, which reflects that every single scene, that poverty never really lets you go. What Bong Joon-ho is doing for his characters is that he's allowing them to believe in a fantasy world where they can escape poverty, where they can have money and a comfortable life, and really be elevated beyond the poverty that they're existing in. But the real world always comes back to bite them. And it's most reflected, if anyone has seen the film, it's most reflected in the main character, well, one of the main characters, if not the main character, the son. I think his name is Ki-woo. He believes in his own ability to escape his poverty. So he does the things in the film to do that, to bring his family up, to try to consolidate his now hold on this rich life. He even goes as far as courting the rich daughter of this family. So he believes that things are going to work out, but they don't. Watch the film, you'll see what I mean. It results in Ki-woo actually being trapped in this idea that he could still escape his poverty. and going so far as the end of the film where he dreams up a scenario in which he does ultimately save his family from destruction. But we know as the audience and also as the filmmaker, Bong Joon-ho knows that thanks to what happens in the film, he's never going to be able to achieve it. Thus, his tragedy is that he believes he could escape this world through dreaming of a better world, but the real world is the real world, and he'll never be able to escape it because he himself is fundamentally not changed. So if you ever get a chance to watch Parasite, it's definitely a film that reflects what we're talking about over here, which is structure can either tell a story of tragedy, comedy, or just a general drama, but really what your point of view about the world and what rather what your point of view of the world is and what you think the character's point of view of what the world is, taking those elements, putting it through a metaphor, putting it through a premise or anything like that, can really extract a structure from that. And yes, what's been happening is that all of these books that we've been reading about story structure and Save the Cats and so forth, they're all after the fact books. So they've looked at stories that have come before, your Godfathers of this world, your Apocalypse Nows, and all these films, your High and Low from Japan, all these amazing films that weren't written with any kind of knowledge as to how films should work. They're looking at these things and they're looking at the common elements behind them, and they're saying, okay, yeah, this is the inciting incident, this is the midpoint, and so forth. Not really realizing that those are the elements in which story has been part of since the days of Aristotle, since Shakespeare, and they really do reflect life as a result. Because I'm pretty sure every single person in this who's listening to this conversation right now has come to understand that if a problem comes into your life that you're not adequately equipped to deal with, if you don't change, that problem will ruin your life. If you don't find a way of adapting to doing something that allows you to overcome it, it will define your life, and that will be the end of the story for that particular thing. However, if you do change, if you do accept a greater truth and you make it into something that you can use, you might be able to overcome that problem. And really, story reflects that, all stories. And that's what makes them exciting. It's what brings back audiences all the time. It's what gets us obsessed, because we find ourselves attracted to the idea that if you can watch someone else's story taking place, you might have something that appeals to us. And at least that's good story. So I think that at this point, Gavin, we're going to hand it to the people to ask questions and answers. But questions, and we'll obviously answer them, and everyone else will try to answer them as well. I just wanted to know if you have anything that you want to add to this. I know that it's big topic. We weren't going to cover everything today, and I think it's something that's going to be an open discussion going forward. Because everyone's got their perspective on how story should affect their own story. So I wanted to ask if you have any last words that you want to add.
Yeah, I guess just my apologies, because I really didn't have space to do justice to, I guess, what is in me to say. And I do hope the questions will tease it out. And yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to the questions as well. Okay, guys, so I'm going to open up the platform. If you want to type up the question in the chat session, or if you want to ask the question, please jump in, put your audio on. If you want to, you can also have a camera on. And this is an open space for everyone to discuss. Khalid, yeah, and also if you can put up your hand in the application itself, we'll be able to see. Khalid, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, hi guys, how's it going?
Hey, good.
Cool. Listen, so there's like 4 of us in here listening to this. It's like a writing room, and so we have a couple of questions, but I'll just do one and then maybe let someone else do it, and then if it gets quiet, I'll ask the next one, so that not to take up all the time. But I think the first question is, I think you mentioned one film, but in your opinion, what screenplay or film have kind of a story structure that's easy to understand that you're speaking about, and that we can kind of watch and dissect? And I'm not talking about Parasite. Don't bring up Parasite. That's a whole different level of filmmaking. Speak to people on the ground.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure, Gavin, you will want to bring up something that speaks to you personally, but I will probably use the most classic example, one of the best films of all time, The Godfather. I think that's probably, if I can think about it in a way that helps us to unpack what you mean by structure, because it is actually everyone thinks it's a complex film, but it is actually quite a simple film if you think about it. Here we have a son who's not supposed to be in this world if things were going to go well for him. If he was going to continue down his line of being a moral, upstanding citizen, then he would never have to be called to do the horrible things he's supposed to do in order to keep his family safe. So here's someone who is not trying to get into this world in which he belongs, in which he's actually very good in being in. But what happens is the master of that world, his father, gets shot down, someone he cares about and loves beyond anything else. And being the only son who can identify with his father going forward, in terms of his abilities, in terms of his responsibilities, Michael is then not forced, but rather chooses to become the one who is the protector of his family. And as a result, he overcomes the odds that his father couldn't overcome. He takes out the villains he needs to, but he becomes the master of this world. He becomes the godfather. And this is something in which he had moral principles that were antithetical to this world. He didn't want to kill. In fact, he just came from a world war where he was forced to kill an enemy that he didn't have a real problem with, other than they were Nazis. So here's something where he is a good person, but has to become a bad, well, he's a good person who does good things, but he has to do bad things in order to save his family. And as a result, he becomes very good at that, and it changes him irrevocably. He can never go back to where he is from. So there's the tragedy of the soul, but there is the triumph of the survival of the family. Kevin, and the screenplay reflects this. If you want to watch the film and then read the screenplay, you will see those key beats that define what I'm talking about with regards to challenging and overcoming challenge, or not overcoming challenge.
I guess I'd rather not speak about a particular screenplay, except to say that any screenplay that you look at can be dissected in this way. And maybe just to consider that in the first 15 minutes of the film, you'll always find the writers hitting up the problem, with the flaw of the character and the kind of the way that the world's out of balance as a result. So yeah, just, to identify then the flaw and the theme. So the flaw is almost always like the negative of the theme. So, okay, let's take American Beauty as an example. It came up last year, and it's more about living your truth rather than speaking it. But, at the beginning, you have Kevin Spacey, who is essentially dead inside. He hasn't learned to live. He's lost his zest for life. And somewhere along the line, generally about halfway through the movie, you're going to find the protagonist gets insight into his flaw. So, sometimes it's just given to the audience. So somewhere around there, they have the packet, the packet dancing, that famous thing blowing in the air, and it's just about learning to see the beauty in life, beauty in the world. And to do that, essentially, you have to start living your own truth. You have to, and you'll see Kevin Spacey. It's a slightly different example, because in a sense, it's a comedic thing, because he does do it, and then he still dies. But because it starts with him basically already beyond the veil, reflecting back on life, it's still kind of like another level of growth. He's just transitioned. But you'll see his journey is to kind of own his own truth. So he steps away from the job that he doesn't like. He starts speaking his truth to his wife, to his friends, his neighbors, etc., and starts doing what makes him passionate, and he slowly comes alive. I think also his real choice is actually not to sleep with a 16-year-old girl, ironically. But it's kind of realizing, he does place her well-being over his own as soon as he realizes, oh, she is a virgin, and but he sees the beauty in her. That's kind of been the thing that brings him alive. It's been his muse, and he chooses morally the right thing in that instance as an actor. And then he's killed by the character, is really the tragic character, the one who could never live his truth, the one who's locked it all up and is dead inside, the father of the boy who has been living a lie. But he does sort of become, the whole thing is narrated by a ghost now who learned the lesson of the film. But anytime you're going to a film, you'll look at, if there's a mentor, the mentor will embody the positive side of the virtue, because that's what they have to give to the protagonist. If there's an antagonist, if you look at where the antagonist, what they embody, they'll almost always embody the negative, the absence of the virtue. So if you just look at the dynamics, really identify the theme, and then look at the character arc, and you'll see how that character moves along the arc of the theme. Any film.
I'm gonna add one more film to it, because I think it's actually two films that are really good examples of the question that's been posed. Is Good Will Hunting. Good Will Hunting is very much a story about change. and it's change of two characters, not just Wool, who's the character title. I mean, the titular character. This is a story about a young man who thinks he knows everything, but has actually got a lot to learn. And the person who tells him, who teaches him that he has a lot to learn, this person who is selfless and humble and so forth, also needs to learn to let go of his wife's death. So this is a form in which we have two characters in desperate need to change and desperate need to come into balance with the world around it. And really through them meeting each other, through them confronting their own problems in this moment of conversation, and them going out into the world and confronting the world with their own problems, they change. And that change is beneficial to not only the one, but to the other as well. And then the other form in which the guy doesn't change and destroys his world around him as a result is There Will Be Blood. Very much a film about a guy not refusing to change, doubling down on not changing. In fact, he's going to go so far as to never change. Why? Because greed is primary for him. He has to win. He has to win, and as a result, he destroys everything around him to win. So check those two films out. The screenplays are also very good. You will see there are very, very defined moments where the character is being called to do something, and either they do it or they don't do it. And you get a sense of the feeling of, okay, there is some kind of structure, there's some kind of balancing act that's happening. And the endings reflect those two aspects greatly. I'm just going to jump to the questions right now. I see Lauren and Luzuko have their hands up. Luzuko, because I saw you first, would you like to go first?
Oh, yes, Tabiso. There are quite a number of things you mentioned, especially when it comes to South African structure in terms of our own storytelling. I don't know whether I'm going to drift off in the conversation, but I think it's very important because most of the time as upcoming writers, we look for producers, we go to funders like your NFEs, your Durban Film Office. And most of the things that they do as you come, maybe they do take your story or they have interest in funding your story. They always go to the structure. And most of the time they will change your story based on the structure they use, especially NFEF, because even Durban Film Office is using the same structure. So it becomes a bit of a tricky one for us as writers, because they will want to follow a certain specific structure which most Americans are using. And you find yourself as a writer now, at some point you need to compromise your own story because of the structure changes the angle of the story or the theme of the story. As a result, sometimes they end up changing the whole storyline that you have. They might like the idea and end up changing the whole story because they feel like in terms of when they have to break it down into a structure, it doesn't really, the story doesn't really make sense the way they want it, because they inspired mostly about, I understand they're competing with American movies, but when it comes to the stories that we want to tell, and you have to break it down into the structure that they use, which is influenced mostly by Americans, it becomes a problem. And most of the guys I know who are writers and who got funding from these structures, they always have a complaint of the fact that when it comes to the structure, their stories end up taking a different angle from what they pitched. So I just want to know, what is the specific thing we need to focus on when it comes to structure? Because I might write in terms of whatever structure I feel like is works for my story, but when it comes to funders, it changes. It takes a whole another angle, which at some point I feel like it doesn't really go with the story that I have in mind. So next time when I go to a funder trying to explain the structure that I've used, and it doesn't go along the lines or how they do the structure in terms of those funders, what's my approach now as a writer? Because I guarantee you, guys I know who have got funding, most of the time their stories take a different turn because of the structure.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so Gavin, I don't know if you want to speak first. I think maybe you have more experience about this. I have opinion, but I suppose it's it's a flawed opinion in this particular case. So please, if you don't mind.
Well, I'll jump in because I do deal with this a lot professionally as an NFEF editor, and as also sitting on the funding panel. Something we have to examine is the structure, and it's a challenging thing because on the one hand, lots of writers don't actually fully understand structure and how to work with it. It is one of those aspects of mastery that one also gets at different levels of degrees of understanding. And so there's two things you really have to get clear on structure. One is the objective plot. Does the one event lead to the other event, and it all makes sense. The other, even more important, is that subjective level, where there is a character with a flaw and they're going to change. And does that plot and that emotional journey of the character, that internal arc, are they working in parallel and working together in a way that really works? Now, if the writer doesn't get that, then often stories aren't conceived in a way that will be effective in the end. And you do have to kind of rejig, and you do have to work with them to reimagine, because the initial concept wasn't fully workable. On the other hand, it depends on the editors and the others, because lots of editors, sometimes do come with that thing of a very predetermined set way of looking at it. And maybe the writer has a real point and, has a real natural thing going, and they don't see it. And then it's a bit frustrating for the writer, because maybe you've got something that works and the editor does have a different idea. And if the two can't communicate and find a middle way through, it's going to be problematic. But it is always a communication between two parties. So, if you can get to that place of having been awarded funding and are working with an editor, then for yourself, the most important thing is to be able to explain why you've chosen the structure you do. It really is to know what your character's journey is, and why the events match, and why it's fitting that the structure you've chosen produces, is used for that journey. If you can do that, then you can have a good conversation with your editor and you guys can figure it out. If you can't do that, then it's going to lead to frustration. So it really is just about knowing enough to be able to work through it. And hopefully on the other end, you have someone who can do the same. If you don't, you've got a problem. If you do, you'll find a middle ground. And sometimes it is a matter of compromise. Often it does happen in the conceptualization, and you do need to change. And also, even if you're not working with an editor or a funding body, every writer will know, like, there's a process, and where you start is not always where you finish. And sometimes a story won't work until you kind of rejig it in some fundamental way. And that can happen in the process of funding, or it can happen while you're figuring it out yourself. There's no one answer fits all. You just got to be able to really know how to speak your side of the story.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump onto that a little bit. I'm going to say that before we get into Lauren and to Kate, and then come back to Khalid in the second question, what's really important is if you find yourself in a situation where you're working with a story editor, because all of these organizations ask for story editors to be present as you're developing a film with them, especially if you are not a experienced writer who hasn't had their work produced before, and they can see it as a result. All of these organizations are all trying to guarantee that the story idea you came up with is something that can work on screen, if that's the assumption we can go for. But however, that being said, you might have that one novel story which doesn't obey conventional structure. However, it is up to you to prove that your story works in that regard. And how do you do that? If you are writing a film, for example, that you've developed over several months of the story editor, but something is bugging you about it, some fundamental thing, the story idea that has been departed from, long ago, and you find yourself obsessed with that, it is up to you to fight for that story. It is up to you to go back to your story editor and explain why the story needs to take place like this. Really, you can ignore your story editor. I know Gary, I know you're probably going to be like, you shouldn't. But the idea is that the editor is there to guide your story development, not to guide your story. So the development that happens with your story, if you find yourself in this new platform, and rather this new space in which your story doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever, you have to go back and figure out why it doesn't work for you. And then you have to come back to your editor and argue for it, fight for your story. Because that arguing, that fighting for it, for that interrogation, you listing down why you think the story should be X, Y, Z, or whatever, you might find the story structure there. You might find the story structure that actually does work for your story idea. And in doing so, you fought for it. You've bought something that works for you now. And that's really what you should care about as a writer, as the storyteller behind it. And a good story editor would recognize, okay, yeah, there's something here. Maybe I should change my tact a bit to work with that. And if you don't find yourself with a story editor that aligns with that goal, then yes, you may have to change your story editor. It is you who receive the funding. It is your responsibility to take that funding and produce the best kind of story. But reality is sometimes the person you're working with may not see things as you currently see them. So you have to work it out together. You have to. There's no way that you can leave everything on the table in your mind and expect it to be in the screenplay. You have to flesh it out. You have to tease it out of your mind. And the story editor is there to help you to do that, not to change your story in a fundamental level. And if you feel that your story is completely left turned now, fight for it. Find out why you feel that way and use that as your reasoning, your arguing going forward to build a better story going forward. And yeah.
I did just want to add one point just to emphasize, because Tabiso is absolutely correct. I don't disagree with anything he said. It's exactly the case. The thing to just bear in mind is that it is a relationship. So, what you say needs to have validity, and whatever they're saying needs to be heard and also have validity. And if you can do that, then you guys will find a way to navigate. It really is about hearing and speaking. And through the NFEF, at least, you can change script editors. It's a mission, and it takes time. It's always frustrating, but it can be done if you find that you're not heard. And if your vision for the story isn't respected, then that's the right thing to do. But you just got to be clear that it's not you who's not hearing good advice because you're stubborn about your story. There needs to be that balance of knowing, when it's a valid point and receiving it, and when it's not and refusing it. But it's a dialogue and a relationship, so that is a skill.
And the last thing I can say about this is that you need to know your story pretty well. You need to know why you're telling the story, because when that why is clear, any questions that come from a story editor as to what aspect of your story needs to be addressed, that why will give you solutions. That why will say, okay, you're right, this thing is lacking. I really want to put something into this, and it does the job for you. So you must ask yourself and be honest with your friends as well. Interrogate yourselves. Do I know why I'm telling the story? And is that why going to inform a better story structure? Okay, Luzuka, I hope that we've sort of answered a little bit of that. Yeah, cool, no worries. Lauren, I know that we've been keeping you waiting. Please go for it.
All good, thank you. Apologies if this is a very beginnery kind of question, but a couple of months ago, I had my first writer's room experience, and it was for a series. And the head writer was banging on and on about 5-act structure, but that's something fairly new to me because my original learnings and was all based on 3-act structure. So I just wanted to know, what's the fundamental difference? And do you guys have a preference between 3-act or 5-act structure? And is a 5-act structure? My understanding is it that that series lends itself more to 3-act structure? 5-act structure, and movies are more 3-act structure, or I don't know. Yeah. Just thought if we could discuss the fundamental differences between 3-act and 5-act structure.
Kev, I'm just going to jump into this because I actually sort of have the answer to this.
Please do. It's not my forte.
When it comes to series, yes, the goal of series is to take an idea and really go to the nth degree for that idea. So when it's a story idea, you're really going to spend episode after episode, investigating it, really coming to something, right? And that lends itself to longer story form telling. So generally what happens is, the 5-act structure, because it's very detailed, a lot of things happen, it usually suits itself quite well with that. And really, if you want to know more about 5-act structure, if you really want to come to a way of unpacking it, there's a book called Into the Woods. I know it's reversed over here. It's Into the Woods by John York, and he is, I'll type up the thing over here. Basically, John York is the head. You've got it as well. Okay, there you go. John York is the head of he was at least the head of the BBC Writers Academy. And the BBC basically focus on storytelling in long form. That's their prerogative, but they also do film as well. So this book is really good in terms of understanding the idea. I won't say it's very good as to giving you a structure or a formula to tell that 5-act structure, but what it does is definitely highlight how common stories have 5 acts. 3-act structure, if you're finding yourself a question, you're questioning what is a 3-act structure, what is a 5-act structure, then in this particular case, I would recommend you read those books, Your Story by Robert McKee, not so much that one, but You Saved the Cat by Blake Snyder. But I wouldn't say that those are the authorities. What I would say is they're actually all the same. 3-act structure, 5-act structure, it's just how much detail you want to do, how much scene work you want to do. Because sometimes you're going to do something for 5 scenes, which can be told in 1 moment in a film. So the reality is it's up to you to decide how much of that story you want to tell, if it's appropriate. And some structures lend themselves to that, some don't. I always look at it as, think about the moments in your film. And the character that you're portraying. How much is gonna happen before that character finally changes? And I feel that's going to be the thing that defines what kind of structure you're going to be going for. So I mentioned before, you've got Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare is probably one of the best examples of very clear structures that are taking place. I'll think of, for example, Macbeth. Macbeth is a story that could be told in 1 act. He says no, and then he dies. That's pretty much it, or 2 acts at least. But because of the nature of the story, because we're obsessing over how he not only says no, but that no comes from a very strong place of him wanting something, that 5 very distinct things happen in his life up until the point at which he dies. And those 5 things just so happen to line up with a 5-act structure. So I would recommend you get this book. It's not a very long read, but it's something that I think can help you interrogate it, because I think what you're asking is something that you shouldn't really be looking to mentors and whatever to find, but I think you should really interrogate for yourself. Watch the films that line up with a 5-act structure or 3-act structure, or whatever, and you'll see they're actually all the same. It's just the steps in between things happening that tells you which is going to be the act that you're going to use. I don't know if that makes sense. Is it something that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and TV, like I said, it depends on which show you're working on. If you're working with a head writer who's obsessing over they need to have 5-act structure, I would say, and I know this is a problem for people to hear, I would say, does the person know what they want to tell for that episode, know what they want to tell for that season? Because if you just interrogate that, you interrogate the characters and whatever, you're never going to need to worry about 5X, whatever. The structure will just appear.
Yeah.
Through that hard work, at least.
Yeah.
Okay, Gavin, sorry.
Yeah, I will just jump in there just a little bit, because I think Tabisa is giving you the basics, but just to make life really simple. I mean, essentially an act is a unit of change. So you've got a scene where there's a little change, you've got a sequence that's a bigger change, and then you get an act, which is a bigger level of change still. And you can, as Tabisa was saying, depending how deep you want to go into that story, you can really examine, the mini arcs in terms of that overall arc that happens. And TV really worked well with that, because it used to have those ad breaks. And when you get to the ad break, you want to have seen like a nice unit, and then kind of leave it on a cliffhanger of change, and then come back. But in terms of a character going from beginning to end, as Tabisa says, it doesn't matter if it's 3 acts or 5 acts. It's really one type of story. And it's just how you're breaking up the flow and the pattern, and it's kind of the beats you're playing to. So it is, as you're saying, it's kind of get to know your medium, but there's very intuitive kind of changes that you would identify and find, and you'll find it in your writing. And if you need to kind of write to a climax more often, which is what the 5-act does, then you'll find that in your story, and you'll identify where there's like those big moments of change, and it will kind of fall into place. Or sometimes people artificially force it in, and
which doesn't
it's a
feel
question.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just going to add one last thing before we jump to Kate. It's basically like this: there's something your character needs to know about the world, and your character's refusing the whole time. And how hard you're pushing that down their throats, or at least allowing them to guide themselves to the truth, that's what informs what you want to do with regards to story structure and everything. Okay, thanks, Lauren. Appreciate that. That was a good question, actually. Kate?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, Gavin and Tabisa, it's been an amazing session, and we are recording it. So how do we get the recording?
I'm gonna let Gavin answer that question.
Sorry, I've been very slack with it, but I am busy creating a YouTube channel where I'll post these things. I've had so much going on in my life that I haven't quite got to it, but I am on it and should sometime have it. And
Right,
then
it's
we'll
really
send
nice.
links through the mail list.
You guys have been dropping gold. And where I asked that question, I've even lost where that question was, so I'm sure I'll get the answer in the recording.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So it's kind of like a question and a reflection that I want to just quickly discuss. And it's about one of my screenplays where a lot of criticism I had about it at once from other people, readers at some stage, was that the character was being too passive. And my whole thing with her was that it was that hard for her to change. So she owned, and it's also from reading the John York, and I keep going, but my structure doesn't fit the 5-act. She doesn't have the mid-act, second act, or the third act. No, if we're going 3-act structure, her turnabout doesn't come mid-second act. It only comes towards the end of the second act, and it's kind of like only then that's the turning point, the crisis. She starts making decisions halfway through the second act. It's the first time she makes a proactive decision herself. But it's a reactive. It's actually not proactive. It's a reactive decision. So she gets dragged along by life and circumstances and decisions getting made for her. And then halfway through the second act, she makes a reactive decision. Then only towards the end of the second act, she makes her first proactive decision. And then she makes the final change mid-third act. And then there's a whole lot of how the world responds to her after that. But so I think what worries me is that it doesn't conform to that, her taking, for me, it's right that it takes so long for her to make a proactive decision. That's the whole thing about her journey, is that it's about forgiveness and trust, and forgiveness and trust in the world, and forgiveness and trust in herself. And that's why it takes so very, very long for her to make a eventual proactive decision, because before she's resistant, then reactive, and then finally proactive. But it doesn't fit into that. It doesn't fit within this must happen at this many minutes, this must happen by the mid. Is that okay?
Yeah,
I guess. Sorry.
Because I've tried to force it before and sooner, and it just never felt right. It just never felt right, because it's that hard for her to stop being a resistant person.
Got you. No, I got you. I understand. Gavin, I think you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just, I guess the question's okay for who, because, if you feel your story works and it feels good on the page to you and it feels right, then it's okay. It might be that, people come with preconceived notions of what the story should be or what it should look like, in which case it probably won't be okay for them. But, it can be okay. It's impossible to tell without actually seeing the story and how it evolves, but you clearly have a good grasp over what her growth is and how it works. And, so my intuition would be that I'm sure it probably is okay and right and, fitted to your story. And if other versions didn't feel right and this one does, then, I guess you just have to look into your own heart and feel, do I feel that this is right? Is this the story? And I will just add that, a lot of the active passive protagonist thing is often dogmatic. We don't always grow through doing. It's a very masculine approach to the world, and also kind of yang American. And sometimes there can be passive forms of growth, where it changes just over time without necessarily, yanking on your hero's pants and tackling the world. So it is just a question of whether it resonates with you and whether when you read it, it's still a compelling story. But I couldn't really say like with any certainty without actually having read the story. If that helps.
I'll just add something to that actually. I think maybe that's a question of tension. I think maybe it's a question of, you said it's somewhat in the middle of the story that she actually starts, making decisions for herself, basically, the second act. I think it was, you mentioned second act. So I think maybe it is a question of tension, and I would say go back to your story and just have a look at the major scenes that happen before that, that final decision of something that's going to happen. Because two films have been mentioned over here in which they have very passive protagonists before they finally make decisions. And that's The Matrix and Training Day. So the idea behind those films is that you have someone who's actually a bystander in a world that's happening around them, and they're forced, they're being carried along until they make final huge decisions that finally allow them to take control of the world around them. So the idea is that the reason why we're watching them is because there's this tension. We get to see in almost every scene them not acting. And when I say about that is that you get to see a very tangible moment of which something they should have done doesn't happen because they don't act. And I think that if you have that tension playing, with all the scenes before that major scene where she finally decides. So it could be simple, like maybe, I don't know the story, but what I'm saying is that it's like maybe she needs to take her dog to the vet, but because she doesn't want to encounter the, usually the violence, not the violence, but like the emotional distortion that comes through receiving bad news about her dog. Maybe the dog has cancer or something. She refuses to take the dog to the vet. So it's your job to show, okay, the dog is suffering. Why is she not taking the dog to the vet? And it happens over and over and over again until you finally reach this point where it breaks and she has no choice. And maybe that's the point in which she actually does decide to do the right thing and take the dog to the vet. But really it's a question of you interrogating, am I showing that? Am I making sure that it's not sitting on the table in my mind, that she doesn't want to act? And that's the reason for it. Am I actively showing? She doesn't have to be active in a story, but you need to be actively showing her passivity. And really that's what builds up the tension. And then you, of course, release it in your second act / midpoint. I see Gavin smiling over here, and I'm wondering
I did want to jump in. Yeah. It's interesting because I think you've made a good point there in terms of what is a passive or active protagonist, because The Matrix, I don't know Training Day very well, but The Matrix I know very well. And one of the things that makes it a really well-written film is that in every single scene, Neo makes a choice. He's put to a choice in every scene, whether it's, and the theme of The Matrix is kind of like, if you're the one, you can do anything. And, Neo's an anagram for one. It's all about him coming to accept that he is the one. And like when he gets a phone call in the office and the agents are after him, and then he's like, go outside, and then he chooses not to. I can't do this. I can't believe in one. I can't believe that I can do this. So then the agents take him away, or he decides there's a choice in every single scene. So he's not passive, even if he's responding to a reality that's bigger than him, because he's always choosing. And if you're putting your character choice, you can see who they are. You can see what their character is because they choose according to their character. So we can see that Neo doesn't believe in himself when he's not willing, well, theoretically, at least in American, big action films, when he's not willing to go outside and go up the building and risk these things. He doesn't really believe in himself. Later, etc. It just keeps playing out that same pattern. Do you believe in yourself, Neo? Do you believe in yourself, Neo? Do you believe in yourself? So I don't know. It's hard to tell. It just, as I think Tabisa's basic point is correct. Is it compelling? Is there tension? Do we stay with the story through it? And if you can do that, I don't think anyone really cares about these philosophical questions of passive and antagonist. If they enjoy the story on the page, then they're sold. And if you read it and it feels good, and you like the story on the page, then there's probably not much for you to do. But it might be hard if other people don't see it. So that's your dilemma.
Thanks.
Okay, Khalid, I know that you had 3 more questions to ask. I'm wondering if you're still on the line and you want to ask those questions.
Off mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, actually, one of the questions is gonna kind of relate to Kate's questions and then somewhat of Gavin's lost response there. So it's about story. I know we're talking about story structure, and it's about structure and craft. Like, how much structure does there need to be in a script in order for it to be perceived as craft worthy, right? Because I think in my belief, and this is a different opinion, we can have this conversation if you want to, if you have time, but I think there's too much structure in South Africa, and I think people write too rigidly to like the 3-act structure, and I think sometimes writers don't get an opportunity to develop a style or take risk or write something where, oh, I just want to meditate on what it's like for a character, you know, like those European films or old French films where there's no real structure. It's about an experience, it's about a feeling. How do you guys feel about that? How do you guys feel about approaching it like that? And then the question in that is, I guess I'm asking for your opinions about writing in South Africa. And then the question is that it's about craft, is how much structure does there need to be for it to be considered as craft? Because if someone writes, for example, like a Kevin Smith Clerks type of film, or Joe Swanberg or Mark Duplass, who really write conversation pieces, how do you critique that? How do you then judge it? And then the 5-act structure, you're talking about Korean cinema. I disagree with your points, though. It's like very different 3-act structure, Thabiso. That's one.
Well, Thabiso, do you jump in first?
Yeah, I don't know. It's cool. I think that story, it's very much this thing about intention. And I think that intention informs the story more than, like a formula, like, this must happen, that must happen, and anything. So I feel that a lot of the times when I look at South African films and series and so forth, I don't feel that the intention is to tell a story that reflects the reality of South Africa or reflects a anti-reality of South Africa. I don't feel that that's there. It feels a lot more like we need to sit down and tell a story that's going to put people into the chairs, irrespective of what that story might be. And I feel that in South Africa, because we don't have that intention fully grounded, we lean on the crutch of story structure. This defined formula from America or this defined formula from Europe as the crutch to tell our stories, not really truly interrogating what it is we're trying to say with our stories. Because the reality is in South Africa, we're asking people to pay 100 Rand for our film to watch, right? Now, there are people who need that 100 Rand to survive in our country, as we recently saw. So it is the responsibility of us as storytellers living in South Africa to tell stories that really reflect our society, really reflect the people that are watching our stories, that we're asking to pay, either a TV license or a movie ticket. So I do feel that I agree with you. The opinion is, I believe is valid, that we rely too much on the crutch to cover up the lack of intention with our story. And I feel that the majority of European cinema, where nothing happens in a film for a while, but we're so intrigued and we so love them, is because the intention is true, the intention is valid, the intention is pure. We're watching a character's life fall apart on screen before they finally make a decision. Now, there's no story structure that can inform that. Now, I feel that's what we're lacking here. And I feel that if we find ourselves focusing more on intention, story structure will bleed in one way or another. Maybe you want to tell a very genre-based film. So it's a horror film, for example. Horror has very, very defined structural tropes. But the intention behind every horror film is always different, which is why we have thousands upon thousands of different horror films. And I'm going to answer the Korean aspect. I do believe that the Koreans have nailed genre more than anyone else because they focus on their intention through that genre. Now, you can have Train to Busan, for example, a zombie film. But because the intention is not to talk about zombies, but to talk about a structural problem in their country, a problem of class, the structure for that story reflects that. And suddenly it is a 5-act structure because now you want to tell different moments that reflect class and class division within that story about zombies on a train. So the Koreans have got this down to a T because they're true and honest about their intentions. And I feel that's probably what defines them from America and defines them from Europe. Because that intention is so Korean, they tell Korean films. They tell Korean stories. And yeah, you're right, that the 5-act structure for Korean film is very different from the 5-act structure for a British film because the intention is completely different. The story they're trying to tell, who they're trying to tell it for and whatever, that is very different. There are some truths in Korea that don't apply in Europe and in America because of the way society is built over there. Yeah, sorry, Gavin, I know you wanted to answer that as well.
I was curious to see what you had to say, but my answer is not that different, but the emphasis will be a bit different. So often when people talk structure, they do get confused with formula, and lots of South African films are imitative. They're trying to follow patterns, genre patterns, or just, this weird structural template. and it's not going to produce a very compelling film because it's just imitative. And art that's imitative just generally doesn't have much emotional power behind it, and much that kind of grabs you and shows you something you didn't see. And the problem for me about I'm not a big fan necessarily personally of European films that kind of just float around and don't do much. If that can work, when it does work, it's because the filmmaker is showing you something that helps you see something that takes you to a new insight and a new place in reality that maybe you wouldn't have seen or noticed. And in that sense, for me, it's more of an art piece than it is a story. For me, we make films it's about the audience. Like for me, entertaining that audience or giving them an experience that transports and transcends and makes it worthwhile going to see a film is the first and foremost consideration in writing a film, because you are writing for an audience. You're not doing it, just for yourself. You're doing it for people to come and see. And for me, you really have to take consideration of them. That said, I think essentially and storytelling is a form of art. I mean, it's the oldest form of art, probably. You can never really create something that you haven't, not authentically, that you haven't actually lived yourself. Like in some ways, even when you're projecting into a different, set of circumstances or different character, if you haven't lived the truth of that arc, of that story arc, like person starts there and gone there, if you haven't actually done that in yourself, then it's almost impossible to create a character truthfully that's done that. If I create a mentor who's trying to teach a lesson that I haven't learned, that mentor is never going to be convincing, because I just don't have it in me to convey something I don't know at all. You have to have actually lived it. And unfortunately, in South Africa, we are too busy trying to tell people the way it is, and not enough just sharing our own truthful knowledge of what we've actually accomplished in our own life, in our own self, in our own spirit. And that's kind of what's necessary. So on the one hand, I think South Africans generally need to spend much more time in their own personal development and growing through and just tackling, we go through a lot in life, but whether we've integrated those lessons and grown past them or not is the difference between a story that's kind of preachy or a story that's a real sharing that takes someone on a journey and gives them the experience of something you've lived. And it's that sort of story that really is, I think there's a lot of it in South Africa that has to come out. I think we've got so many stories that haven't been told, haven't been shown, haven't been seen, because our writers are too busy trying to imitate things from elsewhere, not valuing that really enough their own lessons and their own experience and their own personal substance. They haven't really learned to see themselves, because it's also young, and we're still young in our cinema. So we haven't really, I feel constantly really, I mean, we know the violent stories because it's all so big in us thing, and we get lots of, AIDS stories and unemployment stories, but they're all also very generalized and not enough told from people who have transcended those circumstances to show and reveal to another the same thing. And, I do believe our industry is maturing, and I've seen the standard increase every single year, really. And I think those stories are coming, but there's, I think, a distance that needs to happen between, what you've been through and your ability to share it freely and openly and truthfully. And I think at the moment we're still forcing it, really. And I look forward to a maturation of the industry. And I think then that will happen more often. And I don't think it's about the structure itself. I do think structure is hardwired into us. That thing of beginning, middle, and end. That's three-act structure. You start somewhere, you go through stuff, and either you change, you don't, and when you come back, it's different. And I think that's hardwired into the way we live, it's into the way we think. It's a very natural thing. And if it's not there, then the story won't make sense, even no matter how you break it up and how many acts or whatever. So in that sense, I think it really is just about people owning and sharing and being able to share the truth of their real experiences.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, I know we don't have much time left, but I just want to add that I actually really love films that nothing happens for a while. I'm a huge fan of cinema, and I think cinema is not just writing. I think that cinema is probably the biggest expression of the form, the medium. And I feel that when it comes down to structure, yes, in South Africa, because we are still a very young storytelling crowd, storytelling society, with regards to our stories on screen, yeah, we're going to lean a lot on trying to tell stories that are tried and tested. I do feel as if cinemas, on the other hand, as it has been for many other countries, cinema is the one thing that allows you to unlock story from structure. And just to tell the story of a young girl sitting by the river, just unpacking by herself in her own mind something horrible that just happened. And there's something about it we can watch for 5 to 10 minutes simply because of cinema. So I think that it depends entirely on your intention. If, for example, you're writing a TV series that you want to put onto the SABC and you want to push the envelope, yes, you're going to need some kind of structure, but you also, it presents the opportunity now, I suppose, now that you've listened to us talk about this at length, but it presents the opportunity for you maybe to master it in the way the Koreans may have, where they knew the genre rules so well that they broke all of them when it came down to telling their stories, because their stories, the intention was to tell something that was not an American story. It was something that was very much a Korean story. Khalid, I don't know if you have that one last question for that last minute.
I do. I have more than one question, but okay, cool. So my thing is, I think a statement and then a question, and actually a note on Gavin, what Gavin said. I mean, the whole start, beginning, end. I don't know about, have you seen Netflix films? They don't have beginnings and ends. They just kind of keep going. Not so good, not so good. But really the question here is, so I got a question from one of the team members and they said, what about like Spirited Away? What about the Studio Ghibli films? We love them. We kind of experience them really well, but they don't really have the typical structure of like first act, second act, third act, or even a 5-act structure. So what about that? And I think really what you're trying to get to, and maybe this is a conversation for another day, because this is a whole in-depth thing, but my thing is allowing writers to meditate on an idea, right? Without the worry of format at the beginning. Because for me, I feel like format, I don't know, man, I do feel like it replicates stories. Like the NFVF, my issue with the NFVF, and maybe this is one of the reasons I'm not successful with them, is I just find that everything seems to feel the same by the time they come out, because all the like everything is the same thing. Everything has the same requirements. Everything has to be the same kind of thing. So what ends up happening is all the scripts feel the same, look the same, sound the same. And maybe also because there's like 3 or 4 or 5 script editors doing everything. I don't know. I don't really know how they operate. But that's kind of my statement about allowing writers to meditate. And really the question is the last one, which we had more, but we'll just end it on this one, is the Spirited Away question. How do you feel about the Studio Ghibli format of kind of letting the characters and the story lead the way for the script?
Cool. I think I'm just going to quickly jump into just a small thing, because we run out of time. So everyone who's part of the session, thank you very much for coming through. I know some people have jumped out already, but thank you. I appreciate it. We're going to keep doing this as long as we possibly can to really probe our minds, as Khalid has asked us to do, really probe our minds and try to push this thing forward. Spirited Away, great example of a film that doesn't follow structure, and Studio Ghibli, as you mentioned, yet is so compelling to watch. Mainly because, as you said before, it allows the viewer to take the time to think. And I feel that when it comes to structure, because all the guesswork sort of gets taken out by formulaic structure from Marvel films and everything, you're not allowed to think. You're not allowed to ponder, question. You get force-fed. Here's information. Here's more information. Here's some more information. And I think that because our diet of film and TV in South Africa is that, I mean, I watch a lot of South African film. I try and engage with it as much as possible because I want to know where things are going, right? Now, because we get told, no, you need to do this, you need to do this, because there's a certain amount of disrespect to the intelligence of South African audience. And I'm going to be frank about that. I will be frank, because there's an idea that we have to spoon feed our audiences because they're not going to get complex stories. I think that's a false assumption. It is what unfortunately drives a lot of our way of deciding which stories are we going to put onto Mnet, which stories are going to put onto SABC. Because if it's not easily digestible, they can't easily put it out to people to show. And there is a risk element to it. You know, is the audience going to get it if I don't show something? Bazuka was speaking about it before. I personally understand his quandary. There's loads of great stories that are not being told because they're not easy to digest. So I think that for South Africa, especially, where we have such heavy themes that are waiting to be tapped into, I think that the Studio Ghibli approach, where the writer meditates and then writes, the writer thinks about character, thinks about metaphor, thinks about all these things and then writes. I feel as if that could be the answer for our cinematic form, for our TV form. And we have to grow and evolve before that can happen. Because it took America 30 years in their own cinema system, their own TV system, before they finally developed the platform, or rather the platform was forced into by bigger, powerful agencies in terms of new waves and so forth, that the storytelling format matured enough to start telling more honest stories that reflected reality, and also stories that where nothing could happen for 30 minutes, and that's good. So I think if we have a platform that takes the risk, SABC takes the risk, and it takes the risk, then we might have more exciting stories being told, because that just lends itself to having these kinds of stories being told. I'm sorry, Gavin, you wanted to jump in on that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, there isn't, I don't think, like a definitive answer here, because the SABC and MNET will never take a risk. They are not geared that way, and they don't have the imagination to start going out the box and support people in doing so. NFEF, there's about 15 editors, and one has to find a synergy with them. But for me, ultimately, I mean, partly with Thabiso's point is part of the challenge, because it's not, once you start doing a completely different thing where maybe it's not story driven, but it's just driven by a feeling or an emotion, or a character quirk or something, it often comes down to the cinematics and the cinema. And we don't have a financial system that allows that risk until you've established. And that's not just in South Africa. In Europe, because people are being funded by governments that are just there to fund you, not necessarily to make money. And the NFEF does need to make money. It's a very tight country. They need to at least show that they're not just throwing money down a hole. So they are a little bit more constrained, and if you can create a concept that shows cinematically something that's so different but is compelling and people love and gets an audience, then probably they'd fund you to do another one. But it's something where just generally, and this is the thing in our audience, in our industry, because it's a very cost demanding, it requires a lot of money generally to make film. Very few people get to take chances until they've proved themselves, and I don't think that's going to be. I think it's going to be more the case here. But I don't think there's any objection to it. If somebody can transport me through a piece of cinematic magic, I can't argue with that. I'm keen for that. Show me. And if on the page it might be a bit harder, because sometimes things just don't translate in the words if it's an image or a feeling. So it is challenging. I don't think there's any neat answer to that. But my feeling is if you get to the place, and often it's just because maybe in your own journey you're not at that place where you're going to be so good in terms of your own journey. Maybe already you're better than many, but maybe you're just not that place where your voice has come out and so articulated that we can see on the page exactly the thing, and that it's strong enough to make us go yes. And maybe it's just a journey to get there, because if you can do that, then people want to. I know, like you said, I mean, Thabiso is great to do this with because he's such a film buff. I'm not such a film buff. I'm like really feel very disillusioned with films, and I barely watch films for the last 10 years because I keep seeing the same stories. I keep seeing the same things over and over and over, and it doesn't inspire me. But if you can, I mean, I sort of, in that panel, there's a whole bunch of professional filmmakers who love all sorts of things, from all over the world. And if you can get them, you've got them. I mean, they're generally rooting for difference. They really are. But they just don't often, get the material that allows them to go yes, because they want to.
Yeah, I think, Khalid, I don't know if we've touched on the point or not. I think this is a big conversation to be having. It is an industry conversation. It is something that I would love, the industry stakeholders to be taking up as a conversation point. In fact, it's probably a challenge. Maybe there's someone over here who actually knows someone from the NFEF and they want to differ entirely and say, no, these are the things that we have as our guidelines, the principles, and so forth. And in fact, Gavin is absolutely 100% right. It's you writers who are not bringing us good stories. I feel that's definitely a conversation we should be having. And I think that everyone here, I don't want to dissuade anyone here from writing a story that doesn't have a clear structure. I think that first and foremost, film gets made from story. There's the one thing that excites people with money to pay for it. And it's a weird thing. We don't quite understand it ourselves. We've tried putting millions of different formulas and, you know, assumptions and all these things to it. But first and foremost, if you have a story that excites and a story that even in its boringness excites someone's going to want to pay money for it. And I think that's the one takeaway that I want everyone to have from this. And really, structure can help. It is just a tool. At the end of the day, it isn't the story. It's a tool to help you tell a story, but it's not the only tool out there. And I think that if every person over here walks away with that, we might find ourselves with a much different industry going forward. Hopefully, it's a case that we do challenge the status quo with Mnet and SABC with the riskless storytelling that they're attracted to. Maybe we need a new wave of cinema in South Africa, cheap films that actually tell the stories you want to. So maybe that's something I would ask every person over here to think about. If you have a story that doesn't have a defined structure, that isn't working with the NFVF, Mnet, SABC, and so forth, make a short form version of that. Film it yourself, get people together, test the idea, put it out at festivals, build your name that way. Because there's the one thing that none of these organizations can argue with. And if you have a story and people want to watch it, that's never going to be taken away by them. They have to listen to you in that regard. So yeah, I don't know if that's something that everyone can take, as a lesson from this, but I personally have found that to be the case in myself. And Gavin's right. I love film. Film is the one thing that makes me breathe. So I do find myself inspired. And if you ever find yourself watching films that are just formulaic the whole way across, go back in time. Go see the films in which there was no Robert McKees, there were no Blake Snyders and so forth. See how they were making those films. You might find yourself coming up with a new way of telling stories. The producers of Tangerine didn't wait for anybody. They used iPhones and made it themselves. Absolutely true. Tangerine, I love that film as a result. Right, guys, I know it's like way over time. I just want to thank everyone for coming through and engaging. I really appreciate it. I feel as if story grows every time we meet. It's like, to use the Catholic term, every time we gather, the story gods appear, right? But I think the ideas that we're sharing over here are something that I think every person can take something away from. And I just want to thank everyone for coming through. Yes, guys, I know we haven't touched all the questions. We will have another session in 2 weeks' time. I do believe that if you do come with those questions, ask them. Don't wait for anyone to tell you to do it. Put up your hand and ask those questions. As you can tell, we love talking about film. We love talking about TV. We love talking about story. Gavin?
Yeah, no, just thank you so much. And thank you to Thabiso.
Khalid, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to tackle some more questions going forward. Come to the next time. Everyone who's here, thank you again. We will catch up soon.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, if you're not part of
Thank
the,
you.
put your email in the chat right now. I will be sending emails out. I will send the books that we mentioned and everything. I'll send a follow-up email. So if you're not part of the mailing list, if you haven't received an email from me at some point, put your email in right now. But thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Cheers.
Thabiso,
Yes.
can I send some stuff on your email, like personal stuff?
All right. Yeah. Actually, this is the thing that Gavin and I wanted to talk about the last time. So look, I'm more than happy to look at something. I don't have all the time in the world. I'm also trying to make a living. I'm also trying to make films and so forth. So what I can say to you is, yes, you have my email address. If there's like something that I can look at simply, I can try come back to you about it. Just don't feel hard fallen if I don't come back to you in a couple of months because I'm trying to make a film. No, but look, if there's a question that you want to ask, like send me a log line, and then I'll say, okay, maybe we can look at how that does work or that doesn't work. But please understand and please appreciate that we are carving time out of our weeks to make this session happen. And if you have questions, right? If you have something that's story related, throw it into the group over here. We have a hive mind of ideas over here, a hive mind of writers who might be able to help you. Yes. Okay, thanks guys. I think these are all the emails. Anyone else? Any last emails?
No, all good.
Okay, thanks. Thanks guys. Thanks Gavin. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Thabiso.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you, Lauren. And Nelson, see you.